evening and welcome. I have the pleasure to welcome tonight Studio Thomas Willemse for our first fully digital lecture of Across. Across is a lecture series organized and co-produced by the Vlaams Architectuurinstituut, the Faculty of Architecture of the University of Liège, and A+ Architecture in Belgium. We have a lecture series which is dedicated to young architects, which we invite to cross the linguistic border in Belgium, which means that we invite young Flemish architects to give a lecture in Wallonia, in Liège, and young French-speaking architects to give a lecture in Flanders, in Antwerp. But of course, the COVID pandemic is changing the rules, and we cannot have a big lecture hall filled with people to come to the lecture. And therefore, we grasp this opportunity to have a look behind the scenes and to discover the office and the universe of Thomas Willemse, where we are now tonight. But Across is not only about crossing the linguistic border in Belgium, it's also about crossing another border, the border of age and of experience. And therefore, for each young architect, for each emerging architect, we invite a senior architect to give a lecture about this very small introduction about this group. And tonight we have the pleasure to have an introduction of Arlette Baumans of the office which is based in Liège, Baumans. She will give a small introduction on the work of Thomas Willemse. But before I give the floor to Arlette, I would like to thank the Flemish government. I would like the Fédération Wallonie-Bruxelles. I would like to thank the Brussels Capital Region and Dietrich Limo for their support for this whole organization of the lectures. But now I would like to give the floor to Arlette Baumans. Thank you very much.
Bonsoir à tous, bonsoir à toutes, bonsoir Thomas. En février de cette année, j'ai directement répondu positivement à la revue A+, quand ils m'ont demandé d'introduire la conférence de Thomas Willemse. En fait, son parcours, son travail sont à mes yeux exemplaires. Son parcours. Il choisit de travailler chez des grands, des très grands, Basmet, Bogdan van Broek. Quand il s'associe avec des gens de qualité, Émilie Béchet, Sarah Paute, et ils font Acte. Acte n'est pas l'association de 3 personnes, simplement. Acte, c'est vraiment un partage sans faille et sans limite entre 3 jeunes associés. Je trouve ça merveilleux. Et donc, quand Thomas m'a téléphoné il y a quelques semaines, il me demandait quoi pour la conférence, et il me dit « Quel hasard !» Je lui dis « Mais Thomas, il n'y a pas de hasard. » Et à partir de là, nous avons échangé une correspondance assez intéressante dont je vous livre quelques passages. J'écrivais à Thomas « Il n'y a pas de hasard, Thomas. La traversée des échelles et le déjà là dans les disciplines du paysage, de l'urbanisme et de l'architecture sont les fondamentaux de la conception de nos projets respectifs. Vos projets de Zelle et de Dilbeek sont exemplaires de ce point de vue. Cher Thomas, il n'y a pas de hasard. Votre quasi-obsession de la communication est fascinante et redoutable. Mais je pense qu'avant tout, elle traduit votre sens de la responsabilité de créer un champ de rencontre entre les citoyens, les habitants des quartiers et les experts. Je le lis dans les projets de l'INT de Saint-Gilles. Vous portez en vous un grand idéal et beaucoup d'espoir pour le monde de demain. L'action qui porte au-delà de nous est déjà ancrée dans votre jeune personne. Cher Thomas, nous savons dorénavant qu'il n'y a pas de hasard, il n'y a que des rencontres. Nous savons aussi que pour qu'il y ait rencontre, il faut travailler aux autres, mais surtout travailler à soi-même. Ainsi parlait Rainer Maria Rilke dans les lettres à un jeune poète. Ainsi, cher Thomas, je terminerai ce bref partage. Across, il n'y a pas de hasard, il n'y a que des rencontres, et je suis convaincu que celles de ce soir et votre conférence seront un cadeau pour chacun d'entre nous. Merci Thomas.
Bon, bonjour, je veux vraiment remercier Arlette pour cette belle introduction et je suis très heureux qu'on a eu cette opportunité pour commencer cette conversation, ce dialogue entre nous. C'est vraiment une inspiration d'avoir l'opportunité d'avoir ce dialogue, cette correspondance avec quelqu'un avec tellement d'expérience, mais aussi avec son bureau et on travaillait sur les différentes échelles et différentes disciplines et tout ça. Et je pense que c'est vraiment juste le début de cette dialogue. Pour la suite de la conférence, je vais quand même changer vers l'anglais. Je pense que ça sera plus cohérente. To start really across the language borders, across the ages, but also to introduce oh, there's just an issue. To start across the different disciplines of urbanism, architecture, and landscape. And so the projects that with the studio I really want to look for and work on are projects on according to these with these four elements, with the edge, lenses, fragments, and isms. And the edge, it's really the starting point that these projects are on the edge between different disciplines, and this follows a bit from the trajectory that I followed so far, starting already with engineering architecture, studying this, which is already kind of the edge between two disciplines, engineering and architecture, and then getting from that interested into urbanism, also at the KU Leuven, and continuing studies in urban ecologies at Parsons in New York, through all this experience, really also choosing studios in landscape urbanism, another two disciplines that are really on the edge of other disciplines. And after that, continuing at Bureau Basmet in practice, or starting in practice with landscape architecture, which is another combination. And in parallel to all of that, also really studying on the side graphic design, which kind of emerges or is needed, in fact, for all of these other disciplines. And this background or these different disciplines each give a certain lens on a project, which usually starts really from kind of an eye-level perspective, but all these different lenses can then also be transported from for instance, this bird's eye perspective, where you see through these lenses that you get a very, you can discover very strong landscape elements, like in these three examples, which are in each case is a landscape structured by a small stream that then gives the parallel main road, and perpendicular to that you have the plot sizes, whether it's in Mol in Brussels or Zeele in this diffuse Belgian fabric, you still find very strong landscape or urban figures. And the projects then work to kind of mold the project into a fragment as a puzzle piece that really fits within those different lenses, really molding it to make the strong elements, to make them emerge and to let them emerge and to bring them these qualities to the foreground. And to also make this happen, I also always work with this idea of isms, which is in Dutch in samenwerking met, which is in collaboration with. So each project is a collaboration where other people are added to each team or working in multiple ways to have different lenses again to complement kind of the approach to a project. And in this case also adding each time the client, because they have an equally big impact on the design and are equally part of the team to make a project come reality. Tonight I want to illustrate these elements in three different projects to start situating them, also to show the moving across scales and disciplines. To situate them, the first one is in the Brussels North quarter. The second project is in Lint, which is in between Brussels and Antwerp, and the third one is in Dilbeek, which is just next to Brussels. So for Brussels, it's het Schoolvoorplein Klavertje 4, Parvis d'école Klavertje 4, for the city of Brussels, which is in collaboration. So in this case, I'm part of a new collective that we started, ACT, as also introduced by Arlette Baumans already, with Emilie Béchet and Sarah Poot, and we have already multiple projects within that constellation, together with WOW workshops, with Tractebel and Metrique. And this project is situated in the north area, which is really an area that is scarred, or still has the scars of very strong urban interventions, really tabula rasa interventions. The school, or the project is really situated in between the school, the Maximilian Park, and the 6 social housing blocks. And those blocks are raised on a raised ground floor, with this original idea that in the north area all the plinths of these buildings would be pedestrian zone and would be connected with streets in the air. But these streets never came, and at the moment it's this big urban view that then in reality ends up, the edge of this plinth is really something that's not very clear if it's architecture or if it's landscape. You have kind of an architectural small staircase connecting to quite a big landscape structure. So it's really an unresolved situation, creating weird corners from this very strong urban view. And while we are working on the project, it's clear that these places are unresolved and changing. First, fences were added all of a sudden to make sure that the refugees wouldn't sleep there and so on. And then seeing the opportunity, an association already put like water retention tanks there to gain rainwater, but it's clear that it's an unresolved question. And equally, when you go to the street is very wide. It's really made for the car. So the idea that all of the cars would disappear within these plinths in these massive parking spaces also didn't really come true. So the question is really, what is the next step in the mobility if we imagine in this space of the picture, if we imagine there a square in front of a school, a safe environment in front of the school. And the street itself already has a long evolution of different mobilities. It started as one of the first train stations in the country, connecting with Mechelen, and this really shaped the street. Then in 58, it became the helicopter port. And it still has the name, Avenue de l'Héliport, Heli-Havelaan. And so it's really the question now, what is and then it became a very big paved surface, really for the kingdom of the car. And the question is now, what is the next step? But to really understand that, it's also to understand what happens on the street. And this avenue is very different than the other very wide avenues of the north area with all the office buildings. This street is really connecting a series of spaces for kids and for the youth. So really having the petting zoo, to have the parks, Parc Maximilien, Parc de la Seine, but also a series of schools, neighborhood houses, Pôle Nord, ABC, all things for kids. So really working on a neighborhood level, and equally also having a couple of very important crossings on the spot of the school, with a connection between Tour and Taxis and the North Station for soft mobility. Of course, also the entrances of the schools and the kindergarten, and these connections with the buildings in front, these social housing towers. So after the competition, we summarized our main ambitions and principles into six ambitions or principles, to really show that in this case we really want to go for kind of a very soft approach, very different from the very radical ideas and these very bold gestures of the north area. We want to bring kind of these connections, but still make certain statements, starting with a traffic safe square of and doing this by literally planting 2 trees in the middle of the street, to show that it's no longer just the dominance of the car, to give space to these crossings and make those 3 crossings also really places. So these are really to make them very like little squares on top of this larger square, really guiding these connections. And of course, if we're thinking about this new mobility, this is also the place how to learn to bike and that it's fun, or anything else on wheels. It could also be a scooter, a trottinette, and all these things, bringing green onto the square, but also acknowledging that it's a square on in front of the school in a kind of a larger park with Parc Maximilien and so on, that is kind of also in transformation. So it's really a more mineral surface within a larger green setting. So starting with very subtle interventions, a series of lines that mark or guide these connections, and these are also referring to the former railway tracks. And these thin lines then make the crossing in a simple way between the entrance of the school and the playground, and then slowly these lines become steps, become larger, and make the connection to this space, the garden in between the social housing blocks. In this case, a very simple sketch from the competition, but in reality the actual connection will be much more hybrid structure between architecture and landscape. And in this way, this connection is made, but it also brings then this balcony, gives it the facade of this plinth on to the square, and this facade is then ready to become a new, more public function on the square. Secondly, bringing in between these lines also a smaller texture, a mosaic of different surfaces, and each of these surfaces gives also a certain texture that is an ideal for the users to mark the square, but also reusing the cobblestones that are already there, or having more green infiltration zones where you could park your bike or your shared scooter, the trottinette, and so on, and giving a more domestic feeling in between these very rigid structures of 3 identical towers, for instance. And then having this square also take certain shapes that to learn how to ride a bike, but which is also fun, kind of making the shapes of a surf to learn how to bike, zigzagging between the trees, or a very soft blob for the smallest kids, and each of them also marked with a lantern kind of indicating what could happen there. And finally, for the green, bringing the green that's already there and making the link from the side of the towers also, first of all, to the street, and then to the other side with also rows of different species of trees. Okay. I'm sorry. I will wait for the slides to follow. But maybe in the meantime I can show it on the model. Yeah. So because we have it here, and this is quite convenient. So I will maybe put it like this, so that we bring, in fact, the rows of the existing trees also to the other side, which gives, since they are at an angle towards the street, this gives a very interesting space, because these are different kinds of trees in small rows, which is very different than a typical avenue planting, but it does already give a certain connection or an introduction to the park that is just beyond. And then on the model you see the two trees, the guardians, in fact, of this space that kind of introduce already that the mobility of the square has changed, and kind of the first steps into imagining that the mobility of the whole street, because we're only working on a small area of the whole street, is changing with then the different interventions to learn how to cycle, kind of dotted along the square as a parcours, not only for the kids of the school, but actually for the kids of the whole neighborhood. And using kind of all these different techniques of trying to represent the project in very abstract drawings, but equally using the model and renders, it's really a way to kind of get a feeling in as many different mediums as possible of the project, and to try to develop it in this way. And then, trying to really test a project in as many different ways as possible. So also in the image to start researching the different colors. But then in this particular case, we were also very lucky to work with WOW Workshops, who literally drew already the plan and the whole design on scale 1:1 on the site in chalk, and had kind of a party on wheels, or a workshop with all the kids from the school with their bikes or their rollerblades and so on, to kind of already test out the project. And in this way, everybody, even in Corona times, everybody of all the neighbors could already see or have a first idea of what is coming there, and give input and so on. So this, as a first project, really having kind of dealing with a very strong urbanistic vision, and trying to adapt with something that's really on this edge between landscape and architecture. The second project goes a bit to a larger scale of a neighborhood. So this is a social housing neighborhood redevelopment for the social housing company, the Ideale Woning, in collaboration with Metapolis, Endeavor, Tractebel, and Idea Consult. And this neighborhood is situated really in the center of the town, a town that is surrounded by still by open fields, but also has a very green heart, and right in the center of the town. And the social housing neighborhood is just next to it. And however, when you walk around, you don't feel any of these qualities of this green space. You have endless streets that end up at very banal parking spaces, and that give kind of an overview of all the social housing architecture that is passed in the last 100 years. But the client in this case wants, so you feel very little of these qualities of the park that's just next to it, because the street is parallel and ignoring this green open space. And the client wants to change their housing stock from mainly single-family houses, from row houses into smaller apartments, kind of different sizes of flats. So changing from individual houses to more collective apartments, a collective form of living. But including kind of the extra difficulty that throughout the years people were able to buy the house that they were renting, which gives a very fragmented property structure today for the future development. And we started from this idea of changing from individual houses towards collective houses, to also transport it to the outside spaces. You move from your individual front yard and backyard to a kind of collective version of that. And the collective version of this front yard then become 3 collective courtyards. And then the green spaces in between that are being made by having a more compact type create kind of open spaces, this collective backyard, that then can connect with the green spaces of the central park. So really using the size of the existing street and transforming it into something that has more this collective features, but with the same transitions from going from the street, from the more public space, to your private space. So translating them. And after winning the competition, of course, the first thing that the mayor of the town says is that nothing has been decided yet. But of course, there is not yet a fixed plan, but of course, the ideas and the principles are already there. So also in this case, we, after the winning, we translated or took a step back from the design and translated it into 7 principles and ambitions, really an ambition charter, together with the municipality and the client, really having active, to have this ideal courtyard, to have active open spaces, to have a mix of housing in each of these courtyards, be it private or social, be it existing houses and new houses, or row houses and apartments, adding to this local soft mobility network, having a very climate adaptive neighborhood, with a big focus on rainwater as a resource and rainwater neutral district, and including height accents in both directions, so we can connect with the existing houses and compensate elsewhere. And these are also the abstract drawings that we in the first presentation used to show to the neighborhood, that then already go in the story before we start talking about how we really connect to each house and so on. And this courtyard, this more compact form, makes it possible that we can have this extension of the park, but also looking at this park, it's in fact composed of much more kind of green spaces. It is only the heart is really the park, but you also have the green of the sports, the school, the museum, and the town hall. And so the idea is actually to add green spaces of the green of the housing, and that then become 2 kind of green fingers of the park to kind of add a new kind of green space to extend this center of the town that is green, as also soft mobility network. And this creates then 3 spaces for these new courtyards, but then also introducing in those spaces really collective spaces for the people who live there, because this extension of the park would be rather a public connection to also extend the soft mobility network. And this creates 2 very different sides of the house, as in a traditional way. Really, the front side is at this collective front yard is at the courtyard, where it's a place to meet your neighbors and so on, and it has this transition with some green to create some distance to your front door. It's also the place where you leave your bike, and then having on the other side your private terrace looking onto and using or these green fingers of the park or the collective gardens. Creating in this way also a way to still, since you have the same transitions, to still integrate the existing houses, the private houses, into this larger system. And so the 3 kind of open spaces we're adding are the courtyards of Kasteelplein, the collective gardens, and the 2 green fingers of the park. But it's not enough to just define them like that. It's also about activating and equipping these spaces as you would with your own private backyard or front yard. And so the activation of these courtyards, it's really thinking from a place to encounter the neighbors, but also a more formal space where the kids can play. Or what you would normally do on your front drive is cleaning your car or washing your bike, which is, when you live in a flat, usually something you don't have space for. For the collective gardens, you could then start imagining to join a collective garden with allotment gardening, so you can really garden yourself, or the more easy collective orchard with a harvest once a year. And for the green fingers, really having kind of also more natural spaces that really connect with the rather natural park that is already there. Even imagining that this could be mini forests that have an amazing view for the new inhabitants, but also creating a certain privacy from these more public passages. And each of these elements is also working for kind of all of the lenses that we look at. So they're creating this soft mobility, activities, and so on. And also each of them works, for instance, for the water system, so that you make sure that if one element is really necessary for all of those things, you're sure that it will stay part of the project. And so the infiltration happens in the courtyards with stormwater buffering in these larger park areas, but also using the water, for instance, to clean your bike or to water your vegetable patch. And in this way, you have a series of principles that are very strong, but still leave you a flexible master plan, which in fact means that we didn't end up with a real plan, because there are so many variables where the social housing company is also seeing if they can buy certain houses back. So, and also this will be developed over a very long time period. So to make sure that it's really flexible, there are in fact a whole range of possibilities, with this one really being the the maximum version of the plan, but also another version which has all of the existing houses that are still kept. And both have the same principles and the same ambitions ready. So in this way, we're really sure that all of these versions are possible, but it's also having these strong principles. We are sure that the future changes that will come inevitably in such a long process will be part, or can withstand or can fit within this vision. And also thinking that it will be a very long, probably 30 years, well, development in different stages. Of course, there will be larger and smaller. This is, of course, all questions. We also want to make sure that, since this, to not have the business as usual, where you have first the design, then the dialogue, and then the execution, and all the way in the end, you have the activation of the public space, to bring it much sooner into the process, that you have first the dialogue, then the design, the activation of the public space, and before the execution. And in this way, we imagine that, in a very simple way, that if we take out all the existing houses that are already empty, we have an instant park, and we can already start. And in this way, we want to now start with something very similar, like in the project in Brussels, to kind of have a one-on-one mock-up or test version already of the plan, of creating, where possible, already one of those green fingers with temporary paths, but then also by mowing the footprint of the existing buildings into the flower meadow. People already have an idea where these future buildings will come, and already making a first mini forest to see how this will evolve over time. And on top of that, because all of these things are important to take already along into a master plan, if these are not happening in the same stage, the client is also really wants to make sure that the sustainability ambitions that there are really also part of the final plan. So this part is already the creation of the future buildings, and they want to literally already start harvesting the bricks that are there. And so this project is now also part of the FCRBE program. So it's a pilot program within this larger program with a lot of partners to support us. So that in a very simple idea, we can literally go to the smallest building stones, we take them apart and we put them on site together in a new shape, in a more dense way, creating open spaces in such a way. So a very simple idea to take those building blocks, really the smallest scale element, and just move them around. But of course, when we go into the detail, there's a lot more technical questions that we are studying now and continuing. So to illustrate kind of this whole span from the neighborhood level, but where it's still very important to start thinking already from kind of the larger scale all the way to the smallest building component, preparing kind of already each time in each phase for the next step that will happen. And then the last project illustrates the even larger scale. So this is in Dilbeek, Karenberg and Keperenberg for the gemeente Dilbeek, with the same team as in Lint. And so this is really on a very large kind of city landscape scale next to Brussels. So you see the large ring of Brussels. And the projects, the two sites are along the Chaussée de Ninove, which is a very important marker in the landscape, because in the south you have all the watershed of all the water going towards the Zenne. In the north, the water goes towards the Dender. And it's very clear that this chaussée delineates a ridge between those rivers, and that all of the villages got settled on the tops, on the highest points along this road. And it's very clear, now it's one municipality, but you clearly see still the distinct villages, Dilbeek, Iterbeek, Sint-Anna-Pede and Schepdaal, where the sites are part, on the one hand, of these villages, but also on the other hand, you see in between kind of subsidiary valleys with the water kind of going towards this Zenne watershed. And so the sites are really on this, in between the village and then on the slopes of the valleys. A very strong landscape, the Pajottenland, but then when you go, of course, when you zoom into everything, to the reality of the site, you do see again this very dispersed landscape that kind of got, in this case, very ad hoc added on, and new functions were added until there's no more space to add anything new. And this is the starting point of the master plan. When you walk around also, you notice that there's a lot of spaces that are allocated to different associations, or spaces that are a bit lost in between. This was just done in a very ad hoc way, with extensions, a lot of fencing and so on, where you see that the big elements are really large plateaus of the sports fields or of the cemeteries and the sports halls, with in between all this black space, which is kind of the in-between spaces, which are a bit unclear. But at the same time, it also really already shows that each of them, it's kind of a little island. You have a huge archipelago of a whole series of associations, all with their own wishes and their own spaces and claims to these spaces. So the starting point here was really with Endeavour to gather all of these associations and ask them what they wanted to win out of the master plan, and then see if we could move from that to kind of a win-win between different associations, and move to even a win-win-win and so on, to make sure that we find shared things, so we can make a feasible plan to kind of start sharing certain spaces and see also what they could have in common, to make sure again to build a strong plan. But in this case, really a lot of associations and moving in different steps, also then going towards ambassadors to really start developing the projects with so very wide, from the football club to the fanfare, the theater, and so on. And then from another lens, so that's more the programmatic lens, from another lens, coming from this larger landscape, and also trying to discover, but also reinforce it on the side, to really keep this green connection with the valleys on both sides, and try to limit the expansion of the buildings, but at the same time also acknowledging that both sides are really very much the centers, or the new centers of these villages, and creating kind of the space for that, in both cases with a village square, but in a different way, a contemporary village square. In the case of Karenberg, it's an extension of the market square that's already there, improving the church square, and then adding a new square where you have then the entrance to the cemetery, the youth movement, the party space, the entrance of the football, and so on, creating that space. And in the other side, where there are even more functions, it's really the new center of the village. And in that case, not creating just a big empty space, but gathering all these fragmented spaces that are there and bringing them together into one space. So the actual square is composed of the playgrounds of the school, the petanque fields of the elderly home, a drop-off loop, and a parking that is shared between the different functions. And all of these functions that are now a bit hidden behind the different kind of built-up spaces, all of these functions suddenly get also a face onto that square, which is also possible by, on the architectural level, integrating certain sports fields and cultural facilities into one building that suddenly creates a generosity of space in a completely built-up environment. And as you then see in the model images, you really see that in both cases you acknowledge that there is a new village square or a new square, just that's kind of taking the role that the church used to have. They are very close, but we should really give space and shape this space in both cases. And as in all the other projects, also here, we think it's important that it doesn't just stay a plan in the drawer. And so a first project that then already we executed was more into to kind of preserve the landscape in the Karenberg site in Schepdaal. There are also a lot of questions, of course, in these green spaces, but to make a running track that then kind of integrates all the small questions of the small associations, or of the different associations, the small questions of the different associations, such as having new football fields with a better drainage, to bring in storage spaces, and so on, creating a new games hill for the local youth movement. And in this way, this also really reveals suddenly, as you see in the picture of the games hill, it really reveals also this beautiful landscape that is there. Voila, so these three projects illustrate in this way, or I hope, the kind of the starting points of the studio, where all of these projects are on the edge between different disciplines, starting from urbanism, and then having kind of different lenses that kind of feed the shaping of the element of the fragment that then kind of fits within or tries to improve this existing condition. And each time, each is really part of an ism. It's really a collaboration and samenwerking met a whole team that each of them also contributes to the project, adds their own perspective and their own lenses.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for this lecture, which was extremely interesting and very rich as well, with quite complex projects. Projects where you are working together with a lot of different people, and you say that the ESM, the in samenwerking met, in collaborating with, it's the core of the way you work. But then again, also you work in your own office, you work by yourself. So how does this work? I think this is maybe a question also I would like to peek a little behind the scenes. How does this work if you are working together with all these different parties, and you also are including very much the client as well, and you have your office by yourself? How are the configurations taking place? How do you find each other? How do you distribute the work between you? How do you come to something coherent? How does this work?
So I think in each case, of course, it's a bit different because you're working with different people, but that's exactly the idea, because it's each time also the idea that by having other partners there, it enriches the conversation. So I think that's really the kind of starting point, and the reason why also why you start like that. Of course, most of these collaboration, they start in a certain way, and then in almost all the cases, there are multiple projects, so you also start to have a certain correspondence and a feeling. But I think what is really crucial in multiple ways is that you come together, and then you also take a bit of time to reflect and to work on certain things, and also in the distribution. And I think, I mean, I hope I showed it here, because, for instance, all the models of Dilbeek and Lint were made by Metapolis, which is really their métier. They're really good at it. But it's also this idea that I don't think you can have too many ways in which you approach or test a project. So the very rich thing of this collaboration is that each team member usually comes with a different way of then testing the ideas that we talk together about. So for instance, that WOW, which is then more into participation, comes with the idea to draw the same plan that we've been working on with the same ideas in their way, to do it together with the kids and the people. It's really this idea that you know, like you come together with all your ideas, you put them together into a very strong project. And I think working with different people also makes that there's this critical reflection each time. But then when you go separate ways, so to say, or you work separately, or I work here, that everybody kind of with their own method or medium reflects and works on the thing. And then you come back together and you have all these different views suddenly on the same project.
But that also takes us maybe to the, like, one of the other connecting threads through your work is the fact that you are working also a lot with participation processes, and that you are working together with the population, with the user, the end user. That's one thing. And another thing is also that one of the key parts of all the projects that you showed is the fact that you are introducing more green, more transport, which is like soft mobility, more place for kids to play, all those things that are adding quality. But I'm sometimes wondering, is this sometimes not hurting each other? Like, for example, you know that a lot of participation processes are about these topics, but a lot of people also, they hold on to their car, they hold on to what they know. How are you tackling this?
Yes, and because this is, I think, the only way that we can make sure that the project is a success is that if people also really want it. And I think it's often about finding what is really the crucial point, and that's why I try to show in these projects that each time after a competition, which you kind of do completely separate, really away from all the people, that we then make this ambitions charter, which are extremely abstract drawings and extremely abstract ways of looking at things, to kind of first bring it back to, okay, or is this what we all want to go for? And I think people, they understand this, they want to go along with this. And I think, for instance, in Lint is a very good example where we did this exercise, and the final plan, if you just at a glance, doesn't look very different from what we originally proposed, but in all of its details, there's 2 years of work in between where to discover, okay, what are the real questions, because the big ambitions usually people don't have a problem with. But it's more finding the way that you do it. And then in the case of Lint, for instance, it's really of where are, for instance, the new row houses, or it's very particular questions. And it's really finding then the exact right space for those places, having the exact right place for the apartments, to then kind of, in this whole process, find each other. And I think that's the only way that, you know, that the project will happen and it doesn't stay on paper, is if you manage to get there.
And like last question then, so because you say, okay, I don't want to make projects that are just paper plans that stay in the drawer. So these projects are now taking place, and what are the next phases of the project you just talked about? In which phase are you now?
For these three, so the project in Brussels, we recently had this participation event for the square of the school, and now we are preparing the permit. We had a lot of reactions, also very different reactions, of course. So we are now trying to evolve that. The project in Lint, then we received partial permit for the demolition.
Okay.
Well, it's in multiple steps, and so this will normally next year this will start, and so that will be the first step, and then after that it will be the client who then launches probably new architecture competitions. I mean, this is more up to the client. So to
and then the client is
the social housing company, the Ideale Woning. Voilà. And in Dilbeek, so there already a part is already well. So this first the running track and the football fields is executed, but the larger site, so the one with the larger square, is in fact very complex project. And the part I didn't talk about is this elderly house, that housing. That's one of the larger sites, which is really also crucial, of course, for making that square. And so they had a bit of a slower start, so that they were not ready with what their new direction was when we were making the master plan. So in fact they launched, there was another open call, and so there's another master plan which is more on architectural level, but on a very large scale, that is also being developed to make sure that in fact all of the functions, because they really work as a unity, that they can move along, and that you know, the blocks can move, because it's a full site, that it can move in the right way. So that's a really complex project, and that's why it's taking more steps, especially for the larger partner, which is really this elderly housing complex.
Okay, so a lot of things are happening now at this moment. Thank you very much for this this lecture again, and for all this extra information. I think we are really looking forward to see something realized then also.
Me too.
So I would like to thank also our audience of looking in a very big number tonight to this lecture. And we have another Across lecture coming this month on the 26th of November, where we can welcome the office VVV. I hope you will all be there. Thank you very much.